think we are now on this one.
One second. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, everyone. I think we are now live. Good evening and welcome back to Partition 73, day 2. And here we go.
सुबह जैसे आँख खोली थी आपने सोचा कि चलो चाय वाय का बंदोबस्त करते हैं देखते जैसे आँख खोली इधर भी मुर्दा और मक्खियाँ ऐसी उनके ऊपर कि जैसे कि लेयर ऑफ मक्खियाँ नहीं होती जब तक असी जिंदा तुसी भी जिंदा हो जब 80 मर गए तो फिर उसी जिम्मेवारी साड़ी नहीं
Hello, everyone, and good evening. My name is Ragini from Third Culture Cooks, and welcome to day 2 of Partition 73. For those of you who are joining us tonight, welcome. And for those of you who are coming back after last night's conversation, thank you for joining us once again. Last night we heard from Shubhra Chatterjee, and it was an incredible conversation where we talked through her family's personal experience. We talked through the idea of rootlessness, about suddenly not having any roots and not being able to return to them, which is obviously very, very powerful. And then we also came and talked a little bit about food, about recreating something that satisfies your soul in a land that is completely new to you. Now, Shubhra and I both share a Punjabi heritage and have largely heard of partition from that perspective. And one of my goals of these 16 days was to look at partition from multiple different perspectives, and that is reflected in the various interviewees we have who are going to join us over the next 15 days. One part that I think is generally excluded and underrepresented, which is really what was the partition of the largest state in India at the time, or in British India at the time, is what happened in Hyderabad. What happened in Hyderabad didn't take place in 1947. It took place a little bit later, and we'll get into why that was in a minute. But as the largest princely state, as a very wealthy state, as a state with a very, very long legacy of monarchy and rulership, Hyderabad was very unique in India after independence, in that it held a relative position of power and association with the British that we'll get into, and what that meant for them, and then when they finally decided to become part of India, why that happened. Our guest today is the best person to tell us all about this. Yunus Lasania, or some of you may know him as That Hyderabadi Boy, is a journalist, a Hyderabad-based journalist, who is currently on a mission to archive his city's lesser-known history. He runs the Hyderabad History Project and conducts, maybe less frequently now, but conducts a series of heritage walks around the city to acquaint people better with the incredible heritage of the city of Hyderabad. He is a reporter with years of experience with national newspapers like The Hindu, and he's currently writing a book based on oral history accounts from people who lived in the erstwhile state of Hyderabad when it was annexed to India in 1948. And yesterday we touched on the importance of oral history, and I think we're going to see that again today as one of the most definite ways of recording history in our country when books haven't done an adequate job to date. So, hi Yunus, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. How are you doing?
Good, I'm good. I hope you're doing fine too.
Yeah, so far so good. We're on day 2, and I'm really excited about today. And just to let everyone in the audience know, we're going to try and wrap up our conversation by about 8:50, so with 10 minutes to spare, so that if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the comments, and we'll get to those at the end. So let's start.
Yep, sure. Yeah, please,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why don't you start, Eunice? Just tell us a little bit about yourself, about your connection to the city of Hyderabad. I've read a little bit about when you started doing this more full time, but maybe you can just share with our audience
Yeah,
drew
sure.
you to it, and yeah.
So, I'm pretty sure some people, generally people wonder about my last name, Lasania. Lasania is actually a Gujarati surname. My grandfather basically shifted from Gujarat to Hyderabad, which I'm very thankful for, of course, always, in 1970, I believe.
Okay.
Um, so for me, basically, I grew up in Hyderabad. My entire family has been here from decades now. I think it's been half a century. Uh, and I think my connection to Hyderabad has always been in where I live. For example, the area I live in is called Secunderabad. Secunderabad is the former British cantonment in Hyderabad. Secunderabad basically was a separate city that was running parallelly to the city of Hyderabad. The British had complete control, with the Nizams having no control or administrative control here. So I grew up in a very I guess slightly more Western environment. I mean, anybody who lives in Secunderabad has grown up in that environment. So
Right.
as compared to the Nawabi culture or the old city areas.
Yeah.
But more than that, I think so. I'll just give you a brief about my background. I come from a typical Gujarati business family. Yeah, but I didn't want to do that, so I ended up studying journalism at the end.
Okay.
So I worked with the New Indian Express first, and then later with the Hindu. So it's actually in the Hindu where I started writing about history and heritage, for which I will always be very thankful to my former boss, Sirish Nani Shetty for. Sirish, in fact, if I know, if people think that I know a lot about Hyderabad, Sirish knows much more than me. Yeah, so it's actually, I think about 5 years ago is when I really started getting into the history of Hyderabad. It started with a very small thing. I think the last Nizam of Hyderabad is typically the one of the few rulers from the entire city's history who is well remembered
Right.
for various reasons. One in typical fashion for quote unquote being a miser, but for also being the richest man in the world at one point of time. In fact, Usman Ali Khan was featured on Time magazine's cover in 1937 or 1937-8, one of those years.
Yeah, I read somewhere that he had like 100 million pounds in
Yeah, so
gold and 400 million pounds in something else. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean there are different versions to how much money he had, but at the end of the day, so I'll come to the Nizam point in a bit.
Yes,
But yeah, so I mean, that's a different story altogether. But anyway, as I was saying, so I started writing for the Hindu, and February 24th, 2017 was the 50th death anniversary of Usman Ali Khan. And honestly speaking, I didn't really see anyone writing. As a I started writing about heritage and history with it started with me writing about a small church in Secunderabad where I live. And then I think some days later I realized that the church, another church I passed by, which I used to go to school every day for, I mean, for about what 12 years of my life,
Yeah.
it is the oldest church in Secunderabad. I never knew about it. It's 200 and 13 something years old.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah, so that is the first landmark.
What's the name of that church?
It's called the Saint John's Church, or Church of Saint John's the Baptist. That is what it's called. So that is the first landmark. That's where that was the first church that the British built when they built Secunderabad as a separate place.
Mm-hmm.
So those two things really, it got to my head. I was like, wow, man, I know nothing about my own city. So even before that, my previous boss, my first mentor, he used to always complain about Hyderabad losing its history, heritage, and I paid attention, but I never realized what he meant. And he would always be very extremely nostalgic, talking about how he would go out late in the night and just smoke. Or he would be out all night and with his friends and go to the railway station and write stuff and things like that.
Yeah.
So he was an odd man anyway. But sorry, I shouldn't say that. but but either way, what else? so that got me thinking in a lot of ways, and then I realized that while I was working, I quit the Hindu in 2017 April, and I realized that writing about history on a very regular basis is not something that any newspaper will want unless it is a specific magazine that is dedicated to history.
Right.
For which I realized that there are not too many readers again. But I also realized that people in general want to read about history,
Yeah.
especially about Hyderabad's history, and that there are people who have some information in Hyderabad, and there are people who have a lot of wrong information in Hyderabad. So the issue, what I realized as a journalist is that reporters don't have the time to go to libraries and check and and find old books and information. So they rely on people who provide information. A lot of times, these providers of information give wrong information, and that's what is exactly written, and that's when you end up writing a lot of wrong things.
Right.
So I just wanted to make sure that people who had some people, I just wanted to provide some authentic information. It doesn't matter
No, that makes
how it
sense.
works. Yeah, it's as simple as that. So in that process, I started really good deep diving into history,
Yeah.
and that's how it started. So between all of that, I believe so every year. So now coming to the topic at hand, in 2017 is when in February is when I wrote the article about the Nizam. When I wrote that article, I got emails and I got I got a huge response from not just Hyderabad, but even from abroad.
Right.
And it was genuine praise by a lot of people who felt that nobody writes about Hyderabad, and I was like, wow, there's like lakhs of people here, and this is what the sentiment is.
Yeah.
Then I spoke to my boss, my Sirish, and I asked him if something can be done. So he said, yeah, you should go ahead, and that's why I thought, okay, you know what, even if it fails, I may as well try. There's no harm in
Give it a
trying.
shot. No,
Yeah.
I'm so glad that you did. I mean, it's amazing. For anyone who hasn't checked out that Hyderabadi boy or the Hyderabad History Project on Instagram, please do. It's an absolute treasure trove of information.
Yeah.
Maybe we can start actually with for those of us who don't know, can you just do a very quick timeline of the city of Hyderabad from Qutub Shahi to pre-partition? We'll come to post-partition afterwards, but
yeah, exactly. That's just coming to that.
yeah.
Because so what I've realized during my work is that people have very checkered information about our history with regard to timelines. So people know about the Nizam, people know about something. They don't know the exact time. I think it's not just Hyderabad, but any city if you belong to, you should know the basic history, like who the founders are, etc., etc. So
and I think I've heard you say once in one of your interviews that you feel the Nizam period gets much more attention.
I'm always going to maintain that the Nizams get a lot more attention than what they deserve, because there are a lot of negatives also within them.
Yeah.
Personally, I personally believe that it's my opinion that the Qutub Shahis were not only far more liberal. The Qutub Shahis, it was secular in the true sense. There was no facade of being secular while doing something else.
Can you just tell us, sorry, who
Yeah.
they are, just for those
So
who
So for those of you who don't know, so the Qutub Shahis, so essentially, the background is a little bit in the entire Deccan history. It's not just the Qutub Shahis. So for those of you who don't know, it's very simple here. I'm pretty sure all of you have heard of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, the Delhi Sultanate, Tughlaq Sultanate. So Tughlaq did a very, I don't know what to call it, but he shifted capitals for which he's still called names. So Tughlaq's idea was that, and this is in the mid 14th century. So Tughlaq basically decided that he would shift his capital to the Deccan in Maharashtra, Aurangabad, which was then called Tughlaqabad. So his idea was that he could basically rule he had a huge, at that point of time in the mid 14th century, Tughlaq had a huge country to rule, emperor. So he was the emperor of a large area. So because it also extended down south, he thought he could rule better if he was in the middle, that is the Deccan area in Maharashtra, Aurangabad.
Right.
He shifted his capital. But what he did, so unfortunately for him, when he shifted down south, he had problems back up north. And when he was back up north, he had problems down south. Yeah. So two major things happened under Tughlaq. One is that in 1347, one of his generals, I think Zafar Khan is his name, essentially revolted and formed what is known as the Bahmani Empire. That I believe is the first Persian. I mean, they were Persian, so I would say those are the first. That was the first Persian empire that formed in India.
Okay.
With the capital at Gulbarga in Karnataka.
Okay.
Right. So the other kingdom that formed out of rebellion under Tughlaq is the Vijayanagar Empire, that is Hampi. Okay. So I won't go into Hampi, but I'll stick to the Deccan. So the Bahmani Empire again, it was a parallel empire that ran with Tughlaq, and it survived for much. It survived as far as late as 1518, 1518. So around about 20 years, 20, 30 years or before it collapsed in 1518 fully, so basically you had Sultan Kuli, who was the founder of the Golconda Empire, which is what Hyderabad was under. He comes from Persia and works for the last Bahmani Sultan. So he gets the Golconda fort as one of the rewards for becoming a commander and rising up and becoming a governor, etc., etc. So in 1518, when the last sovereign Bahmani Empire dies, Mahmud Shah Bahmani, that is when Sultan Kuli becomes the king. He becomes an independent king himself. The other ones who become independent are the Nizam Shahis in Ahmednagar, Adil Shahis in Bijapur, Imad Shahis in Berar, and the Baridis in Bidar. So you have these 5 people who basically break off from the Bahmani Empire. Yeah. So the only 2 major empires that ran in the Deccan are Adil Shahis in Bijapur, and the Qutub Shahis in Hyderabad. So that is the foundation. Sultan Kuli basically was a Persian who comes to work from Persia in India, and he prefers the Bahmani Empire because the king was also, they were also Persians. The culture was very Persian. And he builds the Golconda Fort. So the Golconda Fort was a walled city with about 6.5 to 7 kilometers circumference. It's a huge place. What we know as the Golconda Fort in Hyderabad today is only a small, the inner fort. The actual fort is now completely encroached upon from inside and outside. But the gate still exists. So Sultan Kuli built the fort. He started building the fort. It was completely developed between Sultan Kuli, the next one, Jamshed, he's one of his sons, and his youngest son named Ibrahim Qutub Shah. Between 1518 and between 1591 is when the Golconda Fort was a walled city. In 1591, the 4th ruler of Hyderabad, Muhammad Kuli Qutub Shah, who was the grandson of the Qutub Shahi's founder, Sultan Kuli, Muhammad Kuli Qutub Shah basically decides to move out of the fort and build a new city. That is the city of Hyderabad. Muhammad Kuli Qutub Shah, yeah. So it is also a story associated with the foundation of Hyderabad. Is that there was apparently a plague. This was the bubonic plague, I'm assuming. I think that's what it is. Apparently, there was a plague in Hyderabad, and also it is said that the sanitary conditions in the fort also was one of the major reasons for moving out of the fort. And the Charminar, as we know it, is the foundation of Hyderabad. So Charminar was built as the foundation of Hyderabad in 1591. So that is when Hyderabad is built. The interesting part about Hyderabad is that it is compared to Isfahan in Iran. Although Isfahan was built, I think, a few years later after Hyderabad. But so from the way Hyderabad is described in the old books and stuff, if you read, you would think that it is what Istanbul sounds like today. The old markets and stuff where they had a lot of fancy things that came from abroad and stuff. But so the unfortunate thing is that after Muhammad Kuli Qutub Shah built Hyderabad in 1591, the city. So parallelly, you have the Mughal Empire that is running alongside the Qutub Shahi Empire. So the timeline is that the Qutub Shahi or the Golconda Empire is founded in 1518. The Mughals come to power in 1526, 8 years later. So Muhammad Kuli Qutub Shah's contemporary, I believe, is Akbar. And so the Mughal Empire's idea of occupying mostly everything around them is never gone. So after Muhammad Kuli Qutub Shah, his nephew becomes the king, and then his grandson becomes the king. And the Mughals, of course, attack Hyderabad for the first time in 1656. There is another attack in 1685, and finally in 1687, with Aurangzeb as emperor, he before Hyderabad, he takes over Bijapur in 1686, and then he comes to Hyderabad. So basically, Aurangzeb completes his dream of occupying the entire Deccan. And also, what people need to understand is the Golconda Empire was actually a very big area, which not just included what is present day Telangana, but also present day Andhra Pradesh, fully Andhra, Telangana, and some parts of Tamil Nadu also. Some parts of Tamil Nadu also. That is the reason why people in Tamil Nadu, even in Chennai today, speak in Dakhini, which is the language that we speak in Hyderabad. So that influence comes from there, at least from what I can understand. I'll come to the language in a bit if you want. So that is the basic history. So the Hyderabad and the entire Golconda kingdom is taken over by the Mughals. 1687 to 1724, you don't have any rulers, and Golconda area is basically merged with what is the entire Deccan area. And mind you, when I say the Deccan area, I mean it's really surprising. Imagine the entire Golconda area of of both Telugu states, some parts of Tamil Nadu, the entire Bijapur, most of Karnataka, the Bijapur, Adil Shahis, all that is under the Mughals, and then you have the entire Maharashtra, Deccan area also, of lower Maharashtra, and
Mhm.
it's a huge area. What is known as the Deccan. It goes as
Right.
right. Quite possibly at least I think one third or something of what is India today. So what happens is that Aurangzeb dies in 1707, and after he dies, as we all know, the Mughal Empire gets very weak and stuff. The first Nizam was a man named Mir Kamruddin Khan. The interesting part is Kamruddin, the first Nizam's grandfather, was actually involved in the last war with Hyderabad, and he was basically a part of Hyderabad's destruction under Aurangzeb.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah. So and in fact, after Hyderabad is taken over, Hyderabad does not be the capital of the Deccan for a while. It is actually Aurangabad. So, one small, let me divulge for a bit. Something people also need to understand is there's a lot of history even in cities like Bijapur, Gulbarga, and Bidar, because that is where the Adil Shahis and the Bahmani Empire ruled from
Mhm.
before. I mean, the Adil Shahis were the contemporaries of the Qutub Shahis, and the Bahmanis were what preceded the Qutub Shahis. The reason why Gulbarga, Bidar, Bijapur are in kind of ruins and they have not been able to grow, I guess, in a sense, like Hyderabad, is because they stopped being capitals of their respective states. So
Okay.
Hyderabad continued to be the capital after basically between 1687 to 1724,
Hmm.
there was no ruler here. The entire Golconda area was part of the Deccan area, which had a governor, which had a Mughal appointed governor who would basically rule from Aurangabad or anywhere. And the first Nizam comes and takes over as the Nizam. Basically, the first Kamruddin Khan realizes that the Mughal Empire is going to crack and crumble and fall. So he decides to take over the entire Deccan. And Nizam means Subedar. It does not mean ruler. Okay.
Okay.
So yeah, he
Interesting
comes.
point. Yeah.
Yeah, so he comes and takes over. He does
Yeah.
not declare independence. He basically still is a Nizam under the emperorship of the Mughals itself, because he's still paying them the yearly money.
Okay.
Okay. So what he does is he comes here, he kills the existing governor and takes over. He's still sitting in Aurangabad. The one very, very, very less known point about the Nizams is that after the first Nizam dies, there is a succession war between two of his sons and one grandson, and not all three of them are not recognized as official, were never recognized as official Nizams by the Mughals, which is the reason why between 1748 and 1762 there is a gap where there is no Nizam at all.
Ah.
So yeah, so it's a fourth person, another son of the first Nizam, who basically manages to kill the last of those three people and then he takes over as, yeah. So his name is Nizam Ali Khan.
Okay.
After he takes over, he comes to Hyderabad and shifts back here. That is when Hyderabad gets its sheen back as a capital
Right.
from the 1760s onwards.
Okay.
Uh, and one more interesting point under the what people also generally miss out. So we all know that the British were here, etc., etc. But before the British cemented their position in Hyderabad, you had the French also here. So for a very brief period of 20, 30 years, you had a lot of French influence in Hyderabad. So there's a French general called Monsieur Raymond. His tomb is still here. He was
Oh,
apparently a very powerful commander.
yeah.
So that's symbolic of Hyderabad's French influence.
Nice.
Yeah. So
So if
that so
we have now we have the Nizams in power. So
yes,
can we move maybe a little bit further in history, and can you tell
yes.
us a little bit about the situation, both in terms of the relationship between the Nizam and the people, and also the demographics, and how around around the time of partition.
Yeah. So in fact, I
So
was just coming to that.
describe
So
that, please. Yeah.
yeah. So see, if you look at the map of the Nizam's territories between from where I stopped from the mid 18th century up to 1948,
Yeah.
the territory of the Nizams keeps shrinking because they keep losing chunks of it to the British. So
Uh,
towards 1948, at the time of when the last Nizam Usman Ali Khan is ruling,
Yeah.
Hyderabad had a population of, I think, 1.8 crore, of which half, there were 16 districts, 8 were in Telangana. So the Andhra areas were essentially not with the Nizams towards the end, because those were given off to the British, because the Nizams became so poor that they had to pay the British money. And because they could not pay them, they had to give away the territory. That's how the Andhra areas got separated from the Nizam's territory and from Telangana under the British. And it was complete under British control. So
Okay.
that also created some cultural differences, but it's a different story. So yeah, so you had the last geographical map of the princely state of Hyderabad had 8 districts in Telangana, 3 northern Karnataka, that is Gulbarga, Bidar, ke aspas, there's one more I'm not able to remember, and the 5 more districts were in Maharashtra. You know, Usmanabad, Latur, Bhid, Nanded, etc. All those areas. It was a multilingual state. You had half of the Telugu speaking people, and then you had a good chunk of people speaking Marathi, and then you had some Kannadiga people. The relationship of the Nizams is a very interesting question, because now that depends on which area you're in. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
we need to also understand this with some context, and I'm not trying to blame or offend anybody here, but the thing is, okay, before I say that, please understand Urdu is an Indian language. Okay, it was created uh, in India's soil itself, if that's how I want to put it.
Yeah.
But the thing is, Urdu was made the official language in the Hyderabad state, okay, by the Nizams in the mid 19th century, and that is the medium of instruction they preferred.
Was
Now,
that the first time it was made an official language?
I think before that it was Persian, and then it was made to.
But within India, Hyderabad was the first place to
I
make.
don't think so. I think it was before that it was the Mughals, because Urdu eventually came to the Mughal courts, right? I'm talking about the Nizams here. So they adopted Urdu, and one thing that actually happened under the Nizams because of Urdu is that because of Urdu becoming the medium of instruction, is that it became an imposition, especially on the rural population. Because see, Telugu, and I've been across Telangana, and this is something that every elderly person has complained to me, saying that we are Telugu speaking people. See, this is the difference. This is why I say the Qutub Shahis were far more secular, far. It's not about secularism. This is about simply being sensitive to the local population. The Qutub Shahis adopted Telugu. They learned, at least they patronized Telugu. At least I can say that for sure.
Yeah.
But the Nizams didn't. And my from what I can understand, I'm not surprised, because they were Mughals at the end of the day. They came from North India, and you know where they are already learning Urdu. So
Yeah.
I don't think, as somebody who's from North India already learning Urdu, and who there's no reason for that person to come and learn. You have to be really sensitized to the local population, to understand what is happening.
Yeah.
So the Qutub Shah history is different that way. So Urdu ke wajah se kya hua is that the Telugu lost out in a major way. That's why if you look at Telugu literature from the 19th or 20, early from the 20th, from the 19th to 20th century, you'll see that Rayalaseema and Andhra was a major Telugu literature hub. The number of publications and even the literature that came out from Telangana was very less. Like most of the literature that came was revolutionary literature against the Nizam and against the landlords. But in Andhra, it was more literature. There was more creativity. There was more creative literature, basically. If you look at the poetry, if you look at education and stuff like that. The other thing about the Nizam and his relation with people is that, see, as far as Hyderabad is concerned, I'll make it very clear. Towards the end, in the first half of the 20th century, especially under Usman Ali Khan, Hyderabad was transformed from a sleeping provincial capital to a modern metropolis, especially after the 1908 floods. It's called the Musi River floods, under which thousands of people died. So the last Nizam basically wanted to modernize the city and make it flood proof. And I'll say that, credit where it's due. He built a modern high court. He built the Usmania General Hospital. He built a Unani hospital. The Kachigoda railway station came up. You had Usmania University. You had I'm forgetting one more place. I don't remember. Government City College. So you have like institutions that are still running that came up about nearly 100 years ago as part of the city's modernization. So Hyderabad was basically like the jewel in the crown. Okay.
Right.
But the moment you stepped outside is when you realize that not everything is like that, because Usman Ali Khan was the richest man in the world in 1937. But what a lot of people don't understand is that a lot of that money came from tax or forced collections from poor farmers from districts. So the only way the state survived was based on landlords, especially rural landlords. And most of the Telangana landlords were all Velamas, Reddys. They were mostly Hindu. There were Muslim landlords also, but in majority of them were again Hindus, which is just a fact. It's
Right.
nothing else.
Yeah.
And in that sense, like I said, Usman Ali Khan and the Nizams didn't patronize Telugu, but what they did was they didn't shake up the village systems. They let it be just
Okay.
for as long as they got their money.
Okay.
It's as simple as that. Okay. So Usman Ali Khan's money came from a lot of sweat and blood of poor farmers who were being oppressed by landlords, and this is the truth. That is the reason. Now I'll come to the topic at hand. This is the reason why which a lot of people don't understand is towards 1945, 1946, like 1944 also, in fact, probably. Usman Ali Khan, there's also something. Usman Ali Khan was also, I believe, not as hands down as his father. I don't think he would have probably gone into rural areas so much, because otherwise, as a king, he relied on a lot of people. Because if you read a lot of the books that are available, you'll see that each person is telling a different story of Usman Ali Khan. There's one book that calls him the prisoner of the King Koti Palace, which meant that he would never go out. There's one very interesting book called October Coup by the last district collector of Usmanabad. He very clearly writes that he is the. I have no reason not to believe him, because he's a collector who is working on the border areas of Maharashtra between Hyderabad and the Indian Union, and he is saying that he talks about a lot of disturbances that are happening, etc., etc., and he writes that but the prime minister is telling Usman Ali Khan a very different story, that we'll be able to fight the Indian Union and we'll be able to keep Hyderabad separate, etc. So the crux of the matter I'm coming to now, which is the whole topic here, is that as India and Pakistan partitioned, Usman Ali Khan for some reason believed that the British would completely help him out.
Right.
But the British, as we say in Hyderabad, haath utha ke bhag gaye. So they just left him high and dry, and he was very disappointed with that. Now there are different things that ran parallelly, which is one of the reasons why this is one of the most complex histories. I'm just going to list out the different organizations, major organizations. You have the State Congress, which is obviously pro-India.
Yeah.
You had the communists. So the communists are very, I wouldn't say weird, but so these guys were, they were revolutionaries. Their main aim was to ensure that the peasants were free from from landlords. These are basically called Jagirdars in Hyderabad.
Right.
And they were very exploitative. Each Jagirdar had anything between 500 to 40,000 acres of land. And for example, there's a place called Jangam Taluka, which is now a district. Apparently, three Jagirdars combined had control of as many as 259 villages. So that was the extent of their oppression.
Okay.
And the peasants were basically poor farmers, and I'm not even talking about the Dalits who were basically into bonded slavery. That's a different thing altogether. So you had communists who wanted to stop all of this, whose main aim was this. Yeah.
And so they didn't did the communists have a national leaning, or they
eventually did. So okay, so I'll just make this also clear anyway. So the CPI first believed that it could run its own country. 4 people from Telangana and two leaders. So the communists were very strong in Andhra and Telangana. So much so that they sent 4 people to meet Stalin to ask help to start a separate commune or a separate country.
Oh wow! Okay.
And Stalin refused.
Just around partition time. That same time.
Yeah. This is after so in 1946, before everything happened, the communists began something called the Telangana Armed Rebellion against landlords, where basically they started fighting against the state and started killing landlords and driving them out of villages. This is on record by the last commander of the Hyderabad State Army, who says that the communists had control of most of rural Telangana, to the point where they had their own intelligence networks, which was so strong that even the state police did not know what was happening.
Wow.
I mean, this is the last commander himself accepting the fact that the communists kept robbers and highways free of thieves. Sorry, I mean, basically the law and order was in fact much better because of them.
Their hand, yeah.
Yeah, so this happened in 46. This continued much after even independence, up to 1951. So
Right.
I'll come to that in the end. So
Yeah.
1946, the communists have already started their revolution. 1946 for 1947, we have independence. So
Yeah.
around independence, there's one what is today the All India Majlis-e-Ittihadul Muslimin run by Asaduddin Owaisi. Much before his family got involved in politics, it was only MIM, Majlis-e-Ittihadul Muslimin. So this party the was run by one particular gentleman by the name Bahadur Yar Jang, who died in 1944. But his concept of rulership was Anal Malik, which is basically we are the rulers. His concept was that Muslims are the rulers. Okay. So when he dies, the next person who takes over is, in my honest opinion, one of the reasons why Hyderabad witnessed such bloodshed to begin with. So this was a man named Qasim Rizvi who had very megalomaniac and very weird ideas. So this is why I mentioned the book October Coup, in which he apparently, so the last district collector writes that this Qasim Rizvi comes up and tells him things like Muslims are supposed to be rulers, that they have been rulers for hundreds of years, and that they are supposed to be only the rulers, whereas the rest of non-Muslims are supposed to be the subjects, etc., etc. He has that kind of ideas.
And
There's a
so
very
Razakars, his army?
Yes, so the MIM was the political party, and the Razakars was basically his private militia which he ran.
Oh,
He did so. Yeah. So the thing is, before Operation Polo, before Muslims killed 1948, there is, from every single place that I have been to. So non-Muslims have always told me that their families have faced attacks by Razakars. Now, in some cases where people had personal relations with some people in the Razakars, though they were saved because they were apparently warned beforehand about Razakar attacks and stuff. But the Razakars did target non-Muslims to a certain extent, but they also did target communists. Okay, so because they were part of the state machinery
right.
unofficially, but they also went after the communists, and the communists basically. So it's a very extremely mashed up, complex situation. You had the Indian government versus the Hyderabad government, and then in between you had the communists which were fighting against the Hyderabad state, and which did not want to. They did not agree with what the Indian government offered to them, saying that we want complete freedom from slavery, etc., etc. So it became bad, and the Razakars were doing their own thing before Operation Polo. There's a very infamous speech of Qasim Rizvi where he goes up. Where he apparently goes up. There's a very speech on Deccan Radio where he says that हम लाल किले पे आसिफिया का झंडा लहराएंगे. So he's given such speeches.
Okay. Very inflammatory.
So yeah, a lot of inflammatory speeches, and that's what happens. So that is the Qasim Rizvi thing, and then you have in November 1947, November 1st, the Indian government and the Hyderabad government signed what is called they signed an agreement, standstill agreement for a year, where basically discussions are supposed to go on, and nothing is like so. Actually speaking, I believe the government of India came very close to offering similar conditions to what Kashmir was offered. Okay, but if you look at history, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel was completely against Hyderabad being, it's right in the middle of India. For him, Kashmir was quote unquote going by the, going by the quote unquote two-nation theory.
Right.
Kashmir should have gone to Pakistan, technically speaking, and Hyderabad, which had only about 10 to 11% of Muslims, where the ruler was a Muslim and majority of 84 or 85% were Hindus, should have remained, technically speaking, with India. Like, if that's the reason why I believe Pakistan never officially came forward to help Hyderabad, because it would go against the very foundational theory of the two-nation basis. Though Pakistan kept saying, though the Nizam and stuff, his government expected help from Pakistan, that never happened. There's also one very story that exists. I think in some books it's written also that apparently Jinnah comes to meet the Nizam, where he is sitting with one leg over the other in front of the Nizam and smoking, and the Nizam gets angry at him, saying, "How dare you sit in front of a king like this?" And Jinnah tells him, "Boss, your time is up. Your times of kings and queens are done. You can't expect to stay in power anymore."
Yeah.
So that ends that.
So was the wait between 1947 and 1948? I've also read that it was to avoid further violence, given what had just happened in Punjab and Bengal? Is that also one of the reasons that?
I don't think so. It was just a matter of parlays. You know, they were having discussions, and there was a lot of intense discussions that were going on. It's as simple as that. I mean, there are what happened in Pakistan. In a way, did have an impact here. There were there we Hyderabad also saw some people moving to Pakistan. At the same time, we also had our own Muhajirin camps where you had refugees coming here.
Coming, right.
Yeah, so it just kept getting bad. The communication kept getting so bad where the Razakars kept saying nonsense like we will fight the Indian army and stuff. Whereas the very fact of the matter is that L. Idrus, the last commander himself, says that most of the army of the Hyderabad State Army was not exactly trained enough to even fight. That is the reason why during Operation Polo he surrenders without any fight because he knows that it will be a lot of casualty otherwise. And there are a lot of stories about young boys being indoctrinated into as Razakars who fired at tanks with pistols and got trounced upon by tanks and things like that.
So to maybe just give a little bit of context to everybody watching, Operation
Polo.
Can you just describe Operation Polo very briefly before we move on?
So essentially what happened was that the discussion, the discussions between the Indian government and the Hyderabad state government kept getting, I guess it didn't yield any result that was not favorable to either side. Finally, one fine day, I think Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel just had enough of what was happening. Because there were a lot of reports of violence coming from the border districts and about the Razakars as well. So from what I understand, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel just one fine day sends the army, which comes from the Solapur side, to Hyderabad. September 13th, 1948 is when the army comes. It takes them only 3 days to take over, and that is not a war. That is a takeover. Okay. So the reason now here, this is where it gets very interesting, is that they capture the entire state, but the army is not able to take over Telangana completely because of the communists. So from September 48 up to October 21st, 1951, the Indian army was hunting communists because the communists refused to stop their revolution. So so there was a lot of discussions between the communists also, who were discussing about whether they should stop or not. That is when finally, before the first general elections, they also decided to participate in the elections. And that is when the most interesting part here is in Telangana. Out of 77 seats, the communists who contest under the name of PDF, Progressive Democratic Front, they win 42 seats. So that's a lot. And this also happens. So at that point of time,
were present to take those seats.
Sorry.
All of their leaders were present to take those seats?
Yeah, that is the whole problem. So out of 175 assembly seats in the Hyderabad state, 77 were from Telangana. But the communists did not have enough people to even contest. So they were able to win 42 only because of the fact that they didn't have enough people to contest. Otherwise, they would have probably won a little more. So that is what happened. So Operation Polo, the main issue here between Operation Polo is that, see, when the Indian army came, what I'm just verbatim quoting one man from Bidar who I interviewed, whose family literally left their home, walked 30 kilometers between 3 nights, they stayed 30 kilometers away from Bidar. So what he said, that because when they heard that the Indian army was coming and that there were communal riots, they left their homes, they walked between 3 nights in spite of heavy rains, went to Bidar, took shelter, and then came in a bus to Hyderabad, where people, quote unquote, refugees from Bidar and Gulbarga were being given shelter in Hyderabad. So, during Operation Polo, nothing happened in Hyderabad city itself. Like, there were some violent incidents, but there was some looting and stuff. Even the Razakars also indulged in some violence here. There was some violence even after the army came, but it was not so major. But most of what happened was in the areas of Maharashtra and Karnataka, where, according to the Sundarlal Committee report, it says anything between 26 to 40,000 people were killed. But a lot of Muslim scholars say that the numbers are much higher than what is that. I was very lucky to meet one man from Hyderabad who is from Osmanabad district. So this man's father had some links in the Congress, which is why he said that they were lucky enough not to be killed, or whatever you can call it. Very interesting. I met a man from Gulbarga who's little old, who's 1991. So I'll tell you his story first. So this man in Gulbarga was arrested by the Hyderabad police when he tried to blow up a bridge after joining the Arya Samaj. So the Arya Samaj was one of the organizations working against the Hyderabad state and with the Indian government. So he was arrested while trying to blow up a bridge near his own near Gulbarga, and he was put in Usmanabad jail. Okay. So the other guy from Usmanabad who I interviewed, he told me that after the Indian army came, they basically opened the gates and let all the prisoners out. Which means that the man from Gulbarga I met and Usmanabad, both men were probably in the same place.
The same place,
yeah, in some hours before it happened.
Wow.
So yeah, so the man from Usmanabad told me that so he was just a child of 14, 15 years old, but his father was the one who was handling the relief committee in Usmanabad, and he told me such stories. He told me that after the Indian army killed the Razakars and whoever they had to kill and stuff, they put most of the people in the Usmanabad district jail for one night, and they first let the children out, 15, 16-year-old boys. He told me that they made the boys eat some food first, and then they made the boys collect all the dead bodies and throw them in the lake nearby. So that's what he told me that. So this is just one kind of story. So he told me that he told me that what I've seen that day is still stuck in my head so much that even if anybody dies today, it does not make any difference to me. Those are his exact words. Said the things I've seen were just changed me forever. So he told me that, and what the other thing is that his father was apparently part of the relief committee. So he said that because he was good in Urdu and because he was good in studies, so his father made him write down all of the complaints that were coming, like people who lost their homes or money, and he told me he wrote rape so many times in Urdu, but he just didn't realize until he grew up that was actually rape. So there was it was like if so there was violence on both sides before and after partition and before Operation Polo also. You had the Razakars who were indulging in a lot of violence, and then after the army came, you had basically it was not the Indian army directly, but the Indian army allowed a lot of communal violence to take place. I personally believe they could have stopped it, but they didn't. Now the reasons for that, I don't. In spite of the Sundarlal committee report, I have not seen anywhere that anybody from the Indian army was held responsible. Apparently, there was a committee that went around and discussed what happened, but the Sundarlal committee report was kept under wraps for a very, very long time, for decades, and that was by
so actually my next question was just that the Sundarlal committee report didn't come out until much later, and actually many people, I think it's at the Nehru Museum in Delhi now, and most people still don't know that it's actually available to the public for viewing. So why, if you just had to sum up quickly, and then we have a few questions that have come in, so I'll move on to that. But I guess the last question that I have for you is, why do you think the Sundarlal report didn't come out for decades after the event itself? And did the demographic makeup of Muslims and Hindus in Hyderabad change significantly after 1948?
I don't know about Hyderabad city. In city, I don't think it is anything major that changed. But in the state, definitely, I think so many people died. So it would have made a difference, because I've read about villages being wiped out and people killed. So obviously they, like a lot of Muslims in Hyderabad today have families or whose families were originally from Gulbarga, Bidar, have told me things like they have left properties and come here. And one man I met in near Bidar itself, told me that I was talking to him in Bidar, and he told me he was originally from across the border in Maharashtra, and while he was very old man, and while talking, he was like, "Oh yeah, during Operation Polo, we had to let go of 50 acres in Maharashtra, and our neighbor took over, and he's not given it back still." So things like that, I've heard a lot of stories like that also. I mean, that's one thing. The other thing I see it's a matter of convenience basically for the Congress not to talk about Operation Polo, which now will probably come back to haunt them, because if there is anybody who has to get credit in Telangana to free poor people and peasants from oppressive landlords, it is the Communist Party of India, which very surprisingly also never tried to claim that space politically. And that because Telangana and Andhra have a very strong communist past, even up to the 70s and 80s.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so they were that powerful. And yeah, it's a matter of convenience. Also, which government would want to talk about the fact that it let thousands of people die?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, partition. I think the partition violence was a lot more spontaneous in the sense that people were shifting because they were afraid. But here, it was. No, I think the migration majorly happened after Operation Polo to Hyderabad, mainly by Muslims, because
To
of
Hyderabad.
to Hyderabad from the rest of the state, from Bidar, Gulbarga,
Okay.
and other places wherever there was violence.
Right.
So it's of internal displacement. So
So
they,
just to summarize, first you had the communists and the Razakars.
yes,
The
yeah.
Razakars largely attacking non-Muslim populations.
No, the Razakars also attacked Muslims also. Basically, anybody who they felt was against the idea of Hyderabad staying independent.
Okay.
Yeah, so that is the reason why they also murdered a Muslim journalist by the name Shoaibullah Khan in 1948 August as an example to other people.
But were the Razakars, sorry, just a tangential question, were they keen on joining Pakistan with the Jamaica?
No, they basically
wanted
wanted to stay.
independence?
No, they just want Hyderabad to stay independent. And the interesting part is that in the Razakars, a lot of Reddy landlords joined, or a lot of Hindu landlords joined the Razakars because they wanted to keep their lands from the communists.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah, that's why I said it's a lot more complex than what we think.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so you had that in 1946. You have the CPI movement. You had the Razakars. 47. You have partition. Between from August 1947 up to September 48, you have that time period where you have a lot of discussions. Then you
Yeah.
have Operation Polo. The matter does not end. From Operation Polo, you have the Indian Army going after the communists for about 3 years.
Right.
Hyderabad had a military governorship for 18 months after Operation Polo. It was only in 1950 that the last Nizam was made the governor or the Raj Pramukh, and up to the first election, uh, I think he was the governor even after the first election for a while, and then he gave it up.
Fascinating.
But the most important part here I want to emphasize is that Usman Ali Khan continued to live his life like a king. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is what I'm always trying to point out to people. See, he didn't lose anything. He had his wealth.
Personally.
He was still personally very, very wealthy.
Right.
The thing is, if you look at other states, other former princely states in India, I mean, like for example, in what is that Jyotiraditya Scindia's family, nobody calls them traitor in spite of the fact that they went with the British. So here, it's more or less the same thing. They tried to, I mean, historically, you have to judge them by that by what happened then. Right.
Yeah.
So in other princely states, you have people former royal families getting into politics, but that has not happened here, and that is the reason why the MIM so Qasim Rizvi was arrested and he was allowed to go to Pakistan in 1957, and that's why he left. And then the Nizam basically just became. He went around in public life. The last Nizam, if you look at his pictures after 1948 and 1950s, you would think he is some. You would not think he's a Nizam. He has worn torn clothes, like small nicks here. You'll like a very 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 simple white shalwar,
Right.
kurta pajama, and then sherwani on top with a topi. Like you would not. He had apparently he had a very rough voice, but he had a very diminutive presence. It's not like you would think like that man is the king or something like that.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of general love for the Nizam in Hyderabad even today. There are pictures of his death in 1967, and some people tell me that the number of people who turned up at his funeral were much larger than what was at Gandhi's funeral.
Wow.
So it's like that, yeah.
Yeah. So I'll just look at a couple of questions that
sure.
So we have, I think you answered this one. Do the communists still have a political following or relevance in present day Andhra Pradesh and Telangana? And I think you said it was the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, I mean, basically, the communists suffered in 1967 when Puchalapalli Sundaraiah, who was originally from Nellore in Andhra, I think, he was sent here as a leader to guide the Telangana armed struggle. He's an Andhra guy. Puchalapalli Sundaraiah basically still have a lot of ideological differences. So Sundaraiah is present day CPM, Communist Party of India - Marxist. CPM was founded by Sundaraiah and others who did not agree with the original CPI leadership.
Okay.
So because split, they got weaker and weaker, except in Bengal, Tripura, West Bengal, Tripura, and one more place I don't remember. Those were the only, and Kerala. These are the only 3 states where they, I think they still have some relevance in Kerala, West Bengal, little bit. Tripura, they were out of power there also.
Right. And then the other question is, and this actually coincides with my final question, so you can maybe just give some closing thoughts around this, is if we come to Hyderabad today, what is the current share of Muslims and Hindus? And more specifically, I would also just like to tack on to that, after the events of 1948, did that relationship change? You talked a bit about Muslims coming to Hyderabad from the rest of the state,
Yeah,
not many people moving out.
Right.
Yeah.
See, I don't think it is. I don't think everybody came, but you know,
Yeah.
sections of Muslims who were scared, or people who had the means to be able to come here left. Okay. So see, when we talk of Hyderabad today, there is Hyderabad, the core of Hyderabad city, and there is Greater Hyderabad Municipal Corporation area.
Yeah.
So high-tech city is technically not in Hyderabad. So people like me, proper Hyderabadi don't consider Hyderabad to be, so high-tech city to be in Hyderabad. So if you, but if you look at the entire city's population, including the high-tech city area and the other surrounding areas, that would be roughly about 1 crore, of which about 20 to 25 lakhs would be Muslims, so 20 to 25%. But the thing is, the high-tech city areas are completely different. Okay, in terms of culture, there's no, I mean, I shouldn't say, but so the culture there is a very modernistic creation that is existing in any space that has tech and tech IT and stuff, right?
Right.
The crowd is younger. It's a migrant crowd who come and leave for jobs and stuff like that. Some people, of course, settle there, but the core of Hyderabad areas surprisingly have largely remained unchanged, in the sense that, you know, some families have, of course, moved out, have even gone to high-tech, but like, you know, like the culture is still there, and the Muslim population and the Hindu. So this is what I tell people about Hyderabad. I don't find issues like what you see in Delhi and stuff, where you have some form of communal violence flaring up suddenly. Like, agar hua to bhi, there are a lot of Hindus. So people have this general misconception that old city is only fully Muslim. It's not the case. It's 60% Muslim, 40% are non-Muslims. Because if you look at, for example, the vote share of the Hyderabad Lok Sabha seat, MIM or OIC gets, last time he got 5 lakh votes. The rest was between, I think the BJP guy got 3 lakh, and then you had some others. So the entire, so if you, there are pockets of people in different, like the majority of Marwadis, Jains, Agarwals live in and around the old city areas, because they have been historically businessmen who've come and who've set up shops there. Yeah, you have Gujaratis also living there.
Right.
And then you have your everyday Telangana, Telugu people also living there.
Yeah.
And they are most comfortable living in the old city than anywhere else. So there's a joke in Hyderabad when you talk about Anglo Indians. Hyderabadis call them, they say that they're not Anglo Indian, they call them Anglo Hyderabadis, because the food will be similar to what they eat in Muslim homes, and vice versa. So, you know, it's like a shared culture that still exists even today.
Okay.
For most parts. Yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah, and like where I live in Secunderabad, there like, see, there is a point where Secunderabad and Hyderabad meet. Okay, that is close to where I live, in those areas. So it is a little different. But as you go further and deeper into the Secunderabad cantonment areas, it is a lot more Christian dominant there. Like you have the Anglo-Indian community. Hyderabad had a lot of foreigners who were living here even up to the 60s and 70s. They left much later after. So like the leftover of Operation Polo were the foreign teachers, the missionaries, etc., who came from abroad, who stayed. Yeah, so it's a huge mix.
Yeah. Wow. I think. I mean, just to think that in 1 hour we've covered from the 1400s to at least the 1980s is insane. So thank you so much. That was incredibly informative, and I'm sure everyone who's watching also thought the same. And you know, what's really struck me from what you're saying is that one thing that I love to celebrate about India personally is that everyone existing together.
Exactly.
You know, in that space. And so today I think you've really given us a good sense of what those communities were in and around Hyderabad, both before, during, and after the 1940s. So wow, thank you so much.
Welcome. I was more than happy to always talk about this.
Amazing. I mean, I'm just like, my head is buzzing with all of the information that you've just given me, and
I mean in general, anybody else should all visit Hyderabad for sure, because you will definitely find, even in terms of food, So
Yeah, we were
especially,
supposed to do
yeah,
this.
especially you and anybody else who's interested in food.
Yeah.
The city's food history is actually, I don't know why the food history is still very dicey, in the sense that historically there's not too many stories of stuff. I'm not have not gone into that yet, but
Yeah.
there's a lot of food that is there in Hyderabad that you will probably love to explore in general.
I'm
Apart
sure. I'm
from
sure
our
for
Thai,
anyone who saw today, I put a little Mirch Ka Salan on my Instagram as an ode
yes,
to this conversation. So every day on Instagram, if you're following me, I put one dish that will relate to our conversation in the evening.
okay,
And I also just want to say that actually a lot of Yunus's work is around the Irani cafe culture of Hyderabad, which he's often called sort of cornerstone of Hyderabadi culture. And so please go check that out. It's super fascinating. We didn't have enough time to get into that today, but I would have absolutely loved to.
yes,
Yes,
and
and
yeah,
this has been amazing. And thank you to everyone who's joined us as well. Another really interesting, really, really different conversation from yesterday, and taken our minds hopefully to a new place. Yesterday we were in the north and in the east, and today we're in central India.
yes.
And I'm really excited to see where we go tomorrow. Tomorrow we are shifting gears again completely. We are going to be joined by artist Manisha Baswani,
Oh,
and
nice.
Manisha
Yes.
has an incredible project called Postcards from Home, where she
Oh,
explores
wow.
artists from both sides of the border. And
Oh,
I won't tell you too much more today because it is just so, so interesting. And she has spent many, many years documenting these artists and their stories. And I really, really look forward to a very, very beautiful, visually beautiful, and heartfelt conversation with her tomorrow.
yes. I look
So
forward
with
to.
that, thank you so much, Eunice. Thank you
Thank you so
everyone
much
for
for
joining
having
us.
me. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. And we will see you guys tomorrow.
Bye.
सुबह जैसे आँख खोली थी आपने सोचा कि चलो चाय वाय का बंदोबस्त करते हैं, देखते हैं। जैसे आँख खोली, इधर भी मुर्दा, इधर भी मुर्दा, और मक्खियाँ ऐसी उनके ऊपर कि जैसे कि लेयर ऑफ मक्खियाँ नहीं होती। जब तक असी जिंदा तुसी भी जिंदा हो, जब 80 मर गए तो फिर उसकी जिम्मेवारी साड़ी नहीं।